In 1963, a century after the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States was still a nation divided. Segregation kept blacks and whites in separate worlds which were anything but equal.
It would take the courage and sacrifice of the young and innocent to shock a nation that believed itself the bastion of democracy into truly making America a place with liberty and justice for all.
The time had come to say no more.
No more. No more.
In 1954, the ruling of the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education declared that separate was inherently unequal and that integration ought to proceed with all deliberate speed. Not everyone agreed.
And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
In Birmingham, Alabama, desegregation was a dangerous business, no matter what the courts said. With more than 20 unsolved bombings between 1957 and 1963 and KKK associates in positions of power, Birmingham was a stronghold of racial oppression and intimidation. After his setback in Albany, Georgia, Martin Luther King arrived in Birmingham on April 3, 1963, for a make-or-break battle of the dying civil rights movement.
Project C got off to a disappointing start. A court injunction against parading and an 800% increase in bail costs made a trip to jail more likely to last 6 months than 6 days. Marchers realistically feared losing their jobs and their homes. Few volunteered. Fewer were arrested. On April 12th, King tried to draw people by marching himself. He and Ralph Abernathy went to jail. In King's absence, jive-talking James Bevel held the floor at the mass meetings and struck a chord with the young people who didn't have jobs or own homes. They began to volunteer in droves. Bevel started a whisper campaign for student demonstrations. When King was released on April 20th, he was highly conflicted over the use of children as marchers. Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, however, summed up the situation when he said, "We gotta use what we got."
Black parents tried to shield their children from the harsh reality of segregation, but it wasn't always possible.
March of '63, they blew up the church next to our house. My father's car was set on fire. He was also ran off a bridge one night. It was tough.
One of the worst nights of Chris McNair's life was when he had to tell his daughter the reason he couldn't buy her the sandwich she'd wanted at a store that day was that she was black. Still, they hoped. When Barbara Cross and her family moved to Birmingham in 1962, her father, Reverend John Cross, tried to get into a taxi.
And he said, "We don't carry your kind." My father told him before I leave Alabama to be carrying anyone who wants to catch a case.
Civil rights photographer Charles Moore remembers his father saying, "Son, you don't treat people poorly because they are a different color." Other white children were not so lucky. Spoon-fed hatred and lies of black inferiority and prevented by segregation from befriending black children, many believed what they'd been taught. White student Charles Entrekin pointed out that people breathe in the prejudices of their culture without any understanding of what they're taking in. It takes something to wake them up. The children of Birmingham were about to wake up the entire nation. On May 2nd, DJ Shelley the Playboy announced, "Kids, there's gonna be a party at the park." It was a signal. Black students of all ages climbed out classroom windows and over fences.
They called it D-Day for the demonstrate today at 12 o'clock noon. I know we were all leaving school.
Some children walked as much as 18 miles to congregate at the 16th Street Baptist Church, site of mass meetings and nonviolent training for the movement. They would face the police they'd been taught to fear. At 1 p.m., James Bevel began sending them out in groups of 50 towards City Hall.
We was the first group out of the church. We got about 4 or 5 blocks and we were stopped by the police. Bull Connor came up and they put those so-and-sos in the car. And when they stopped us, the fear.
Bull Connor and the police were waiting and herded the children into paddy wagons and off to jail. After an hour, they had to commandeer school buses. 973 children were arrested. On their best day, the adult demonstrators had managed 32.
Went to jail 9 days. My experience in jail was horrible.
Cells meant for 50 now held as many as 300 children. Officers beat bodies back from the door with a chain in order to open it far enough to admit more prisoners. While D-Day had yielded many arrests, the events of the day were fairly non-violent. That would not be true of Double D-Day. Once again, students came by the thousands. This time, policemen were waiting with German shepherds and fire hoses. For an hour, students were quietly arrested. But Connor was running out of jail cells. He needed to scare them into stopping. Firemen doubled the water pressure to 100 pounds per square inch. Bull Connor gave the word to let him have it. The water literally blew children off their feet and swept them down the sidewalks. Witnessing this, black millionaire A.G. Gaston interrupted his phone conversation saying, "I can't talk. My people are out there fighting for their lives and my freedom. I have to help them."
Carolyn Mall and 2 other students took shelter against the wall of a nearby building. The water tore her sweater and ripped hair from her scalp. Charles Moore was there to capture the events on film. The water had scattered the students, but as the noise died down, a small group of students still standing could be heard singing, "Freedom." The students regrouped. Police dogs were set on the marchers and even some of the bystanders. Spectators, demonstrators, firemen, and policemen were sent to the hospital. 1,922 children were sent to jail, but the jail was full. They filled the jail yard and were taken to the fairgrounds and locked in the stock pens. Most would stay for 1 to 2 weeks. Wherever they were imprisoned, the songs of the movement rang out and gave them courage.
The effects of the Children's March came quickly, beginning on Miracle Sunday, when parents and children marched together. In spite of Connor's order, the firemen refused to attack. More than 20,000 students had skipped school to go to jail. By May 10th, the businesses of Birmingham had had enough and agreed to desegregate. As children returned to school, however, they were informed that they had been expelled. The school board's decision was appealed all the way to the district court in Atlanta before it was overturned and the students were readmitted.
On May 17th, Life magazine published an 11-page spread of Charles Moore's photos of the Children's March. More than half the country read it. In 186 cities across the country, people marched in support of the youth of Birmingham. In the White House, the photos sickened President Kennedy, who, bolstered by the courage of the children, at last called for change.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cry for equality that I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
On July 23rd, Birmingham repealed its segregation ordinances, and in August, the March on Washington showed the movement was national. That fall, the schools of Birmingham were integrated. But after all these successes, the children would be asked to make one more sacrifice. On the morning of September 15, 1963, just as the Sunday school classes were ending and youth were preparing to usher on this special Youth Sunday, dynamite ripped through the 16th Street Church.
I had planned to go to the bathroom with my friend, and my teacher stopped me and gave me an assignment. I saw Annie, said, "See you in a little while." 15 minutes after I heard the blast, it was a horrible noise. Ground was shaking under us. Something hit me in my head, and I was screaming. And I heard all the kids screaming. Everybody running outside, crying and looking for their loved one.
5 girls in the basement women's restroom were buried under 30-inch thick pieces of the wall. 4 of them died.
My dad saw a gaping hole in the basement where the bricks were blown away. And so when they started digging, and after about 2 or 3 feet, they found the girls' bodies blown together.
The nation was appalled. The need for change was painfully clear. There could be no more Birminghams. The tide of support for civil rights swelled, flowing into Washington and pushing the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation. The next year, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 resecured rights that had been part of law but not part of life for a century.
I like to think that my friends, through that bloodshed, that was a down payment of freedom. That was a down payment on history.
The courage and sacrifice of the children finally broke the back of the rule of fear and hatred.
Their innocent hope and bravery revived a dying civil rights movement and changed the future of their world.
They would be afraid no more.
In 1963, the city of Birmingham, Alabama, became a battleground in the fight for civil rights. But it was not only the adults who stepped into the fray. The children of Birmingham emerged as powerful symbols of courage and resilience. The events of that year marked a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement, revealing the brutal realities of segregation and the fierce determination of young people to demand justice. The bravery of these children not only galvanized a movement, but also transformed public consciousness, igniting a fire that could not be extinguished. Birmingham was known as one of the most segregated cities in America. The oppressive atmosphere was palpable, as systemic racism permeated every aspect of life, from education to employment to basic human rights. The local Black community, frustrated by years of discrimination, began organizing protests, sit-ins, and marches to demand equality. However, the city's leaders responded with violence and intimidation, demonstrating that peaceful protests would not be tolerated. It was within this context that the Children's Crusade emerged. In the spring of 1963, young activists inspired by the Civil Rights Movement and guided by organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights, ACMHR, decided to take action. They recognized that the fight for their rights was not just the responsibility of adults, it was their future at stake. They began organizing marches to confront the injustices they faced daily. On May 2, 1963, thousands of children, some as young as 6, gathered in Birmingham to participate in the planned march. The bravery displayed by these young activists was nothing short of extraordinary. They were fully aware of the potential consequences, yet they were driven by a profound sense of justice. They chanted, "We want to be free," embodying the desire for dignity and equality that had been denied to their families for generations. As the children marched, the response from local authorities was brutal. Fire hoses were unleashed on them, powerful enough to knock them off their feet. Police dogs were set loose, attacking those who dared to stand up for their rights. Images of children being violently confronted by law enforcement filled newspapers and television screens across the nation. These harrowing scenes shocked many Americans, exposing the raw brutality of segregation and the moral bankruptcy of the status quo. The national reaction to the events in Birmingham was profound. The images of the children suffering in the face of such violence ignited outrage and empathy among people who had previously remained indifferent or uninformed about the civil rights struggle. The bravery of these children humanized the fight for civil rights, making it impossible for the nation to look away. The movement gained momentum, and support surged from people of all races, urging an end to segregation and discrimination. This turning point in Birmingham was not just a moment of outrage. It was a strategic victory for the civil rights movement. The attention garnered by the Children's Crusade helped to escalate the demands for change. It laid the groundwork for the historic March on Washington later that summer, where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. The children's courage in Birmingham had rippled outward, fueling a broader movement that would eventually lead to significant legislative changes. In the wake of the Birmingham protests, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, making segregation illegal in public places and banning employment discrimination. This monumental legislation was a direct result of the pressure applied by activists, including the brave children who had faced down hoses and dogs. Their willingness to stand up for their rights helped to transform the landscape of America, making it clear that the fight for justice was far from over, but significant progress was being made. The legacy of the children of Birmingham is a powerful reminder of the role that young people can play in social movements. They showed us that the fight for justice does not rest solely on the shoulders of adults. Children can be fierce advocates for change. Their actions sparked a movement that continues to inspire new generations to stand against injustice and demand their rights. As we reflect on the children of Birmingham, we must honor their bravery by continuing the fight for equality. We must recognize that the struggle for justice is ongoing, and that the voices of our youth are crucial in shaping the future. Just as those children stood up against oppression, we must empower the next generation to speak out against injustice and advocate for their rights. The spirit of the children of Birmingham lives on, urging us to continue the fight for a more just and equitable society for all.